Conversations on effective conservation with Simon Naylor, Phinda Private Reserve in South Africa, Origins and Management.
This is the first audio of the interview that we had with Simon Naylor from South Africa in Gonalesu National Park, Zimbabwe. Simon was born in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. Simon has been the park manager for Phinda Private Reserve in KwaZulu-Natal for 16 years. In this interview, he starts telling us how he started in the business of wildlife conservation in the 90s, when was kind of started in the country. He started as a guide working in Phinda, in his homeland. Then he couldn't find a job as a park manager, which is what he wanted to do. So he moved to Tanzania, Kenya. He worked in Botswana for around 10 years to return to Phinda to become the park manager in the early 2000s. Then Simon explains us Phinda's history as one of the very first projects in Africa where a whole landscape was restored from farmlands, almost completely devoid of wildlife, turning it into an effectively managed wildlife reserve. This implied the translocations of thousands of animals and the total change of land use from agriculture, actually I think it was pine plantations and sugarcane, into wildlife and ecotourism. This is something that has been done now in a few places in Africa at a scale absolutely unparalleled in other continents, but at that time Phinda was the largest restocking of wildlife in South Africa and in the world. So clearly they were pioneers. He also explains the relations with local communities living on the other side of the fence and who chose in some cases to include their land within the collective reserve. It is also fascinating to see how they ended up building a wild landscape by joining together lots of different properties with different landowners, including communal lands under an association and shared land use, in this case nature and ecotourism, with a unified management, which in this case Simon led as park manager. He also explains the long-term process of training and empowering local communities so they could manage their own lodges inside the shared reserve. Let's listen to what Simon has to tell us.
To be honest, I didn't know what to really prepare, so I haven't really prepared much other than lots of photographs and maps and a few other things. And Ignacio was very clear with me that, listen, you're not going to put a presentation together, you're not going to control the narrative, you will field lots of questions. So I'm happy to answer all your questions. But thanks for the introduction. I met Ignacio, it's been 6-7 years ago, and we've kept a good relationship and a friendship. And even though I don't work for And Beyond, I left Phinda this year in end of May. He asked me just to come and share experiences, share knowledge, share learnings with you. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you. It's the first time for me to come to Ghana Resort. So I'm very, that was, the selling point, yeah. But I'm South African. I grew up in KwaZulu-Natal, and since a very young age, I knew what I wanted to do in life. I wanted to be a conservation manager. And so I studied conservation in Cape Town. I was very fortunate. Back then there was very few, this is 1991, there was only 2 courses in South Africa where wildlife managers could go and learn wildlife management, what we called nature conservation back then. And I was selected. There was only 30 people chosen, and I was very fortunate to be selected. So my career has really been, I've been very fortunate, in terms of doing what I wanted to do. However, I'm giving you sort of background of my starting, but The place that I wanted to work for is, back then it was Natal Parks Board. We went through lots of change in South Africa, and I never was selected. I never got a job with the Natal Parks Board, which is what I wanted to do. And so I ended up becoming, and I didn't want to work anywhere else. So I ended up applying for a job with a company called Conservation Corporation Africa, which was at the time quite, there weren't many companies that were doing wildlife and tourism and conservation in South Africa. And so I ended up becoming a guide at a place called Phinda, which is circled on the map there. It's in Zululand, in KwaZulu-Natal, which is where I wanted to be. So I was like, well, I'm where I want to be, but I'm not quite doing what I want to do. But maybe there's a chance in the future I can become a manager in Zululand. So I ended up being a guide for many years there, which was actually very good for me because I learned a lot about nature and wildlife. Even though I had studied it and I knew a lot about nature, it was only when I became a guide that I really, you spend 10, 15 hours a day in the bush, and you learn all the trees, you learn all the birds, you learn everything about you. You follow lions, you understand their behavior. And so, in fact, it was actually very, very good, I think, good grounding to become a wildlife manager later. You really understood the bush. I later then ended up in East Africa, in Tanzania and Kenya. Our company and beyond, it changed its name, started to, it got lodges up in Serengeti, Masai Mara, and I spent 4 years there training guides, recruiting training guides, and managing some of the camps there as well. So it was amazing to spend. I lived in the Serengeti for 4 years, but ended up in Sulu and Ruaha. I spent a lot of time in the Masai Mara, and so it was really, really good experience again, understanding different landscapes, and how they operated. Even though I didn't do any wildlife management, I then ended up in Botswana. I took a position as operations manager for mobile camping safaris. We run very luxurious camping safaris in northern Botswana, where guests come and they camp and they move around and they go to the Savuti and Chobe and Moremi and the central Kalahari. And I did that for 2 years. I learned a lot about business, managing people there. Botswana is quite a tough place to work, and so that was very, very good experience. And then a position at Phinda came up. So it took me, what was that? Almost 10 years or 12, 13 years to finally get the job that I wanted. And I applied for a job, conservation manager job at Phinda, and I got the job and I went back to Phinda after a long period of absence away. And I was there for 15, 16 years. So yeah, that is my very, very short story. And so but it was really at Phinda that I learned how to be a sort of a wildlife manager and conservation manager. Yeah. So I thought it would be very good. I've got a video, a very short video of. Thanks. Of Phinda. And then I thought it would be very good just to give you a very short history of Phinda, because it kind of gives the background and the context of what was required at Phinda when I arrived. So when I arrived, Phinda was, when I came back as conservation manager, Phinda was very small. It was still being restored. There were still animals coming back to Phinda. And in the 16 years that I was there, we really expanded the park a lot. We brought a lot more species in. The park matured a lot. We were very fortunate to be involved in lots of translocation projects. We moved rhinos, we moved elephants, we moved cheetah, we moved a lot of lions. We collaborated a lot with African parks. We brought in a very I was very much for applied research and monitoring. We brought in monitoring programs. We brought in a lot of research programs. We collaborated a lot with other universities, etc. And so we started to build up a really big portfolio of studies. I think at the time we're sitting on maybe 30 master's projects, 6 or 7 PhD studies, a lot of monitoring, vegetation, that sort of thing. Fire. We were very innovative with fire. I think some of you know, and trying lots of things, different. We would, if someone came with we want to try this, I would say, yeah, let's go for it. Let's try it. Different types of burning, etc., etc. So
all in a profit company.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, we really had to innovate and make a plan with money. We didn't have money, So, and then obviously the community component was very important. Phinda, you'll see, was built on a lot of community involvement, a community trust, giving back to the community. But the community was always on the other side of the fence. It was always an arm's length away. But in the 16 years that I was there, we started to bring in community land, community ownership. We sold land back to the government. Land rights went back to the community. And then when I left last year or year before, we had our first community lodge on community-owned land. And the community started to really play a part in managing the park. They joined our board of directors. They had representation. And so the community was a big component in what Phinda is today. Phinda is an incredible story. And I thought it would be good just to chat quickly about the history, because it's a place that didn't exist until about 30 odd years ago. So that photograph you see on the top there is actually on Phinda in the early 1900s. There was the land was occupied by the Zulu people. So but at the turn, in about 1830, 1840, you started to have European hunters coming, and the landscape started to change. The records of hunting in Zululand are, when you read them, you just cannot believe how many animals were shot and killed. A lot of skins, tusks, rhino horn were shipped to Europe and America. I mean, Zululand was known for its large herds of buffalo and elephant, and literally in 50 years, it was all wiped out by European hunters. And what followed afterwards, in the early 1910, 1920s, you started to then get European settlers. So the European hunters came and removed all the animals, and then you see the Europeans, eh? And then you get the pioneers, the settlers came and transformed the land for pineapples, cotton, cattle, and so the wildlife started to really, what was left was depleted even further. Then in the 1930s, 1940s, you had tsetse flies, Nagana, the disease Nagana. And the people that had the cattle couldn't farm cattle. So what they decided to do was, and they believed wrongfully that wildlife was carrying the Nagana. And so they shot out all the wildlife. There was huge campaigns, hunting campaigns. The government would give bullets and guns to the farmers. They shot thousands and thousands of animals, everything from bushbuck to warthog to mongoose, you name it, they shot it, because they believed that wildlife was killing the cattle.
Because it was an African disease carried by African animals.
Yeah. So by 1950, there was nothing left. There was no wildlife. Maybe an odd leopard and hyena here. They then came and sprayed DDT for mosquitoes. So and tsetse flies. I mean, it was just a nightmare, you can imagine. And the last lions were shot out in 1950. The last elephants were all gone. So literally the landscape was empty of wildlife. Until about 1990, a couple of people had this vision, which at the time was unheard of. I mean, it was, no one thought about taking farmland and turning it back to wildlife. And including local communities. At that stage, nature conservation was, you know, you had your game reserve, your fence, and people had no right to be inside that game reserve or receive any benefits from those game reserves. And these innovative thinkers arrived and decided that they wanted to create this game reserve from nothing. And so in 1990, they started to buy up farmland. And at the time, there was politics. South Africa was very unstable politically. There was drought. People, especially farmers, were very nervous of this new government that was coming. There was elections coming soon, and they decided to sell. They were like, we've had enough of farming and struggling with nature. And so Phinda was created. At the time, there was nothing like it. There was only state parks, Kruger National Park, Natal Parks Board. There wasn't such things as private game reserves. There was some hunting around in the area, but for tourism, nothing. If you were a tourist in South Africa and you wanted to go to a game park, you had to go to a state park. There was no private parks. And so Phinda was started, a fence was put around, animals were brought in, and at the time it was the largest restocking of wildlife in South Africa, and I think in the world, actually. Yes.
How big is it?
Well, now it is over 30,000 hectares, but at the beginning it was 7,000 hectares. Very, very small. And so lions came from near the Kruger, elephants came from the Kruger, cheetahs came from Namibia. There were some rhinos that came from a neighboring game park, and all these animals were brought in to restock and rewild and restore the land, because there was nothing there. There was a few leopards and some hyenas, some small antelope. And so this all started in 1990. And then buffalo came a little bit later. But this was all new. And I mean, I can talk for hours on some of the challenges and the aspects and the innovation that took place to do this. I mean, this had never been done before. Yeah, I mean, I obviously wasn't here, and there's some, I don't know, you can see young Martin Rickleton. I mean, Martin is still very much involved to this day in translocations and restoring landscapes. Les Carlisle was very involved. Luke Hunter is just out of picture there. You know, he did his PhD on lion and cheetah introductions at Phinda. So there was a lot of groundbreaking work that took place here in bringing animals back.
Pilanes Reserve was happening around the same time?
At the same time, yeah. Very, very similar time. Yes.
Who came up with the idea?
So there were three people.
Thank you for asking.
Sorry, two people. One was a gentleman called Kevin Leo Smith, who was a property, he sold properties, he sold farms. He was a real estate agent. And the other gentleman was a property developer. And he, sorry, his name is just,
doesn't matter.
Yeah. But they came up with this idea, but they started it, but they didn't have the tourism background in how to develop tourism and also how to attract fundraising. So they brought in a person called Dave Varty, who started Londolozi in the Sabi Sands. And so the three of them started this company called Conservation Corporation, which was the company that started Phinda. So they all brought in some expertise. And because tourism was going to be the underpinning driving force behind making the model work. And I've got a picture of the model, but the model is very simple, and it's a model that is now used everywhere. It's tourism, good service and hospitality, a good wildlife experience that conserves, the wildlife, and then the benefits to communities. I mean, it's for us now, it's a very common model, but back then, it never existed. It was new to conservation certainly in South Africa, and what made it unique was it was on private land. But really, the driving force was business, was tourism business. It had to be profitable. I mean, back then there was very little philanthropy. There was no NGOs. If this had to work, you needed to attract tourists, charge a certain amount of money. That money needed to go back into operating the game reserve. And for many years, this business never made money. It was backed by investors in this, but it's profitable now. It makes money, which is quite remarkable. Obviously, the thought of bringing lions into this landscape for communities was challenging. However, I think people bought into the vision of creating this enterprise where jobs would be created and benefits would flow. And so communities were quite excited about it. And because they were brought in from the beginning in the design of the project, and so when the lions were introduced, they were present for the introduction. And also there was agreements with the community. For example, the lions had to have collars on for the first 3 years. There was compensation and insurance, and so their fears were allayed from various decisions that were made. So, but the communities were very, very, very encouraged and very happy about this new sort of development, because it was a very poor area, and it still is today.
And Simon, how much of the area is fenced?
All of it.
All of it.
Yeah, it's entirely fenced. Yeah, and
You grow, you remove it. How
So this is just, this is what it looks. In fact, this is an old map. There's already another new piece of land that has been included, some community land that they claimed and got ownership, and we've included it in.
And they asked to be included recently.
Yeah, this is all community land. This is community land that has been brought in. But Phinda started with that small piece up here. That was Phinda, then that was bought, this was joined, and then this is all pieces of land that has come in. So, some communities, mostly communities, and others are private.
But not
farmers.
living there, the people. They are owners of the land, but you don't have villages inside the area.
Yeah, this was a cattle farm and hunting farm. And 10 years ago, they removed all the cattle, all the hunting, and then they opened up to Phinda, put some lodges. And so it's, in fact, the whole of Zululand has changed. If you look 30 years ago, it was all cattle and hunting. Now it's all game reserves. The value of this land has doubled, because of wildlife. So it's been a remarkable transformation of not just this area, but the whole region. Yeah.
In the map of the left, you have this 2021 Makassar. Is that the new one?
That's the new one. Yeah.
So this is community land that they said, hey guys, can we join in? Can you pull down the fence and put it on the other side?
Yeah. So what we did was there was a fence here, and we basically just took the fence down and built a new one.
It may be good that you talk about Munywana as a larger.
Yeah.
So they get an idea of how the landscape it keeps growing.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to do it now or later, but because once you understand Munywana and the connection with Nkusi is important.
Yeah. So Phinda, everyone knows it as Phinda, but technically the legal framework is made up of a number of landowners and entities. Phinda is just one. And so they created an association called the Munywana. The Munywana is the name of a river that runs through. And so that is the legal entity of this conservancy or this game reserve. And because it's an association, it manages the park on behalf of all the different landowners. So there's all of these little pieces of land are owned by different companies, individuals, communities, community trusts, but they all have representation in the association. And collectively, the park is managed by the association. The main responsibilities are law enforcement, wildlife management, fences, road networks, visitor access controls. So those are the things that are managed commonly on behalf of everyone. But each landowner is responsible for their own land management. So bush encroachment, fire, alien plants, roads, those sort of things, they take on their own responsibility. But it's managed together, communally. I mean, when I left now, there's two communities that actually own land now in this game reserve. So I would say from about there up, that's all land that's now owned by communities, by community trusts. They were making in excess of 4 or 5 million rand a year from leases or traverse arrangements, etc. And that's a lot of money in a place, in an area where there's high unemployment and there's no opportunities for businesses. So the business of conservation was the driving force, but behind the expansion. And obviously with that comes conservation benefits, jobs, all these sort of things. Yeah. I sound like who's that character from the TV show The Simpsons? You know, that the one with the hey? Mr. Burns? Yeah, Mr. Burns. But it's not. But at the end of the day, if we cannot make money, it will not sustain. It can't exist. Whereas I think Isimangaliso was the other way around. It's not about making money. It's about conserving wildlife and biodiversity, but we obviously focused a lot on conservation. It was part of what we did. But always the CFO, the chief financial, is always watching the financial statements, and the budgets. I mean, talking about. I didn't study business. I don't come from a business background, but I've learned to become a businessman. Reading financial statements, managing budgets, reforecasting. We focused a lot on finances. Watching costs all the time. So that was very important. Yeah. The business of conservation is not well understood by communities. They see luxury lodges, they see tourists paying 12,000 rand, $1,000 a night. They just think that there's lots of money to be made, and so getting them to understand that it's actually not a profitable business. It's quite a marginal business was very important, and that's why we included many of the community leaders in the management structures of the entire game reserve. So they can see the financials, they can see how much it costs to run this game reserve. So you lower the expectations of dividends and benefits at the end of the year from wildlife. I mean, for example, we would sell rhinos and they ask, well, how much do you sell a rhino for? And look, now you can't sell a rhino, but a few years ago you could sell a rhino for 500,000 rand. They see you selling rhinos, and they want the share, of the sales, but what they don't see is the costs. And so we went through a process of lots of workshops and engagements on showing communities, especially the leaders and the structures involved in the game reserve, how it works, because it's quite a complex place. It's not an easy business to understand. But I think they understand now. And one of the communities actually has a lodge now there. Sorry, there. This land that they bought in, they inherited a lodge, and so now they are the owners and the managers of this lodge. They were adamant that they wanted their own lodge. They wanted to run it themselves, and they're learning very hard lessons. But obviously, there's a lot of hand holding. There's a commitment from the other operators to help them. Because it doesn't help not helping them and letting them fail, because to run these businesses can take many years to establish. It's not easy running lodges and businesses in game reserves. And so they have their own lodge now, and they're learning very fast the business of tourism. It's not easy. So to answer your question, it's a process. It's hand holding, it's workshops, it's meetings, it's very time consuming. Many of these communities, they don't understand business. I remember one of my duties was, when I arrived, this land had just been claimed and been given back to the two communities. They didn't even have a bank account. I had to take them to the bank, open up an account. They started to get money. They didn't know how to write an invoice. So we had to help them, show them how to write an invoice. They didn't have a computer. They started to get money in the bank, lots of money. And then it was like, guys, you only earning 1% interest in the bank. Why don't you open up a money market account? You can earn more interest. They didn't understand money market. They didn't understand inflation. So we had to get people to come and teach them inflation. What is inflation? Rather put your money in a money market, because if you're only earning 1% interest, the money that you've got in the bank is actually losing value. But they were like, no, but we can see the money is there. It's still $5,000. It hasn't changed. Yeah, but it's not worth $5,000. And for people to try and understand that was very hard. So it's been incredible to see how much they have grown from those days to now having their own lodge. But it's taken almost 20 years.